Good afternoon. My name is Tim Kawahara, and I'm the Executive Director of the UCLA Ziman Center for Real Estate. We are a joint research center of the UCLA Anderson School of Management and the UCLA School of Law. I have the great pleasure of welcoming you all to campus today. We have great weather, and it's a beautiful campus, if those of you who are not Bruins and are just visiting. We have an exciting program scheduled for you today. We've titled it Housing as Healthcare. This is actually a follow-up program to an event that we did in partnership with Mercy Housing last year, exploring affordable housing and long-term health care for seniors. Some of you perhaps were there. I recognized a few similar faces. The Ziman Center's partnership with Mercy Housing has grown into a truly meaningful and important one over the years, and we're very pleased to be partnering with them once again. Both organizations are focused on providing leadership and public awareness, on providing leadership to wide-ranging issues related to affordable housing, which has reached really critical, if not crisis levels, as you all know probably in this room, especially in major metropolitan areas like Los Angeles. We also share a common board member with Mercy Housing, Howard Levine, who has generously supported both organizations through his leadership and through his philanthropy. With his wife, Irene, Howard has endowed a groundbreaking program, in fact, at the Ziman Center to provide teaching, research, and thought leadership on issues related to housing, including, of course, affordable housing. The program is called the Howard and Irene Levine Program in Housing and Social Responsibility. The program enables us to leverage the rich intellectual assets at UCLA to help address some of the most critical public policy issues facing society today, from the future of our housing finance system in the nation, as well as homelessness. I would like to recognize a couple of Ziman Center, my Ziman Center colleagues. I don't know if Julie Linder's in the room, but she's done a lot of heavy lifting putting today's program together, as well as Gail Shepard, who perhaps you met outside. And I would also like to recognize our really awesome partners at Mercy Housing, Doug Shoemaker, who I'll introduce in a second, Barbara Shore, Rick Sprague, and Amelie de Pasquale. I think we may have a representative from public office here. I don't know is Derek Gailey here? Derek is from LA County Board of Supervisors, Supervisor Hilda Holise's office, 1st District, Los Angeles County. So welcome and thank you for being here and for your leadership. And with that, I would just simply like to recognize my previously mentioned colleague, Doug Shoemaker, who's the president of Mercy Housing California, who has a few remarks, and then we'll introduce our keynote speaker. So thanks again for being here. Really appreciate it. Yeah.
Thanks, Tim. So I also want to thank the Ziman Center and Tim and Julie and Stuart and the other folks that have really been helpful. Obviously, Howard and Irene, who really have made this partnership possible. So they're not here today, but are really the guiding force behind this thought process of sort of trying to figure out how to take some of these topics and step away from maybe the day-to-day nuts and bolts of it a little bit and talk about it at a higher level, which is a little bit of what we're going to try and do today. And I want to thank all of you for coming, and we'll talk more. This is going to be a nice interactive, hopefully, opportunity for all of us. But so nationally and within California, I think we're all aware that we face some really complicated and interrelated challenges. As Tim mentioned earlier, I think we all have our favorite affordable housing crisis statistics. I'll let you think about yours, but one that I recently saw was that we have 6 of the 12 most expensive housing markets in the country. Likewise, I'm sure many of you have your kind of worst income and wealth inequality statistic that sort of guides your thinking in this regard. But one that I just recently read is that when housing is factored in, California actually has its poverty rate rises to 23.4%, which makes it the highest in the nation. And so the highest in the nation is really awful, but think about 23.4% of a population that's considered to be in poverty, and you ask a lot of questions about the soundness of your society. I'm sure Mitch will talk more about this and Steve, but the healthcare cost issue, I think, is one that's familiar to all of us. Healthcare costs, we continue to be the country that spends the most per capita on healthcare. I think there's been some minor improvements in that regard. But we have some challenges that are looming that I think are making it harder and harder, and I think we're going to talk some about homelessness today. But as Tim mentioned last year, we talked a little bit about the aging of the population. For folks that don't know, there's a huge baby boomer generation about to retire, and between 2010 and 2030, the number of older Americans is doubling. And I forgot to write down the number, but it's something like 78 million Americans. And an amazing number of that, of folks, are actually living seniors that are actually paying more than 40 or 50% of their income to rent, which further complicates all the issues that are before us. We're going to talk some, Sharon, I think we'll talk in more depth about Medicaid, but one factor that's sort of driving and pushing all of these things together is that when you think about that $400 billion Medicaid budget, 31% is spent on long-term care for seniors and people with disabilities and others that need long-term care. So you think about that retiring generation, and you think about the pressure on our healthcare costs and what we know about the affordable housing shortage. And so it's not surprising that we're having as large a homeless crisis as we have. Not just here in Los Angeles, which is obviously of epic proportion, and Mitch is going to talk a lot, and I'm sure others will, about what we're all trying to do about that. But nationally and throughout the state, I mean, we just have a huge confluence of factors, and there aren't a lot of things pointing in the direction that say, like, suddenly this is all going to get better. But the good news is this panel is going to fix all of those things within the next 30, 45 minutes. If Mitch doesn't solve it, the rest of the panel will before then. So no, obviously that's not what's going to happen today. But really what we've asked Mitch and Steve and Sharon to talk about today is sort of how to be as forward-thinking as possible about the relationship between health and housing. I think there's a lot of ways in which people have come to understand, and certainly I'm sure everyone in this room, how those things relate to each other in tons of ways, whether it's around kids or families or seniors or people that are homeless or people with significant and complex disease. There's a million different connections, and some of the time that we spend together is spent lamenting how we can't figure out how to work together better. But we're going to try and keep that to a minimum. We got all our venting out on a conference call, and so we're going to be as forward-looking as possible on that. Mitch is really going to lead us off, and then we're going to have a panel discussion, and then we're going to open it up into questions and answers. And I hope we'll do well with the discussion. By way of introducing Mitch, I guess I was just sort of reflecting on, the ways in which myself personally and Mercy Housing and the intersections that have occurred over the years, and I'm sure each of you has a similar thought process in terms of how you've come to this topic. Mercy's sort of long been interested and active on this. The women religious that founded Mercy Housing are also the same women that founded a lot of the Catholic healthcare systems. And so we have a longstanding relationship with Dignity Health and St. Joseph's of Orange. And that sort of is in our DNA, if you will. Our mission statement is actually about building healthy communities, and housing is more of a means to an end than the end. But it's been enriched, I think, over the years from a Mercy Housing perspective, and for me personally, by working in Los Angeles and San Francisco, which are sort of epicenters of sort of innovative approaches to housing. And as I think about it, a lot of it really comes back to sort of relationships with Dr. Katz, first in his role in San Francisco. They're directing the Department of Public Health, and now here in San Francisco. But they've really changed over the years. I think the first project that Mercy worked on with the health department in San Francisco was around HIV and AIDS. And one of the first efforts to kind of create permanent housing in that regard. And then around nursing homes and trying to figure out how to help deinstitutionalize and enable people to move out of nursing homes. And tremendous success in that regard. I'm sure you've heard us cite the statistic, but the Department of Public Health has done a lot of research on that deinstitutionalization and a $22,000 a year savings per person for Medicaid and Medicare. And that, I think, has driven all of us to say, God, if that's even replicable at half that benefit, how do we figure out how to do more and more of this? And I think that's really guided Dr. Katz's work, sort of what he's been pushing on over the years. Now, with Dr. Katz here in Los Angeles and Mark Trotz, who's really been a huge part of that with Mitch in both locations, just an opportunity to do more and more. And I think one of the things that I appreciate about Dr. Katz is I just have really never seen the guy get intimidated by big topics. You can see in the biography, in addition to the 2 or 3 things I mentioned, he's accomplished some amazing stuff. He's managed to do that by enlisting people and really getting them to believe that these really large issues are solvable, that there are things that we can really do about them, that we don't have to spend all our time lamenting them. He surrounds himself with incredible people, and I think enables them to kind of move forward with great sense of vision and a real purpose in the world. And I think that's what's happening now with the health and housing activity here in Los Angeles. So as daunting as the homelessness crisis is here in LA, I personally feel like we're going to make tremendous progress on that, and it's in large part because I've seen what Dr. Katz has been able to accomplish in other settings. So I won't repeat the biography. It's there in your packet. There's many pieces in that. I'll just note that Mitch did bike here, so it's sort of like the beginning of our healthcare conversation right there. And with no further ado, Dr. Mitch Katz.
Thank you, Doug. And I, too, was thinking about my relationship with Mercy and all the great things Mercy has done. So the first project we did together was 1992. That's when Mercy agreed to help a struggling AIDS residents in San Francisco. So very grateful to Mercy, and looking around the room, I'm very grateful to many of you here who have been working on the housing issue. And certainly my talk is not going to be about why housing is so important, because we already know that. I want to focus us on how do we move forward. I do believe that housing is the solution. I believe that homelessness, unlike many medical conditions and social conditions, is a completely curable one, right? Unlike various forms of awful cancers or wearing out that occurs at the end of life, right? When I have somebody who is homeless, I can cure that. I can house them, and they will cease to be homeless. You know, I ask you to think about how many other chronic diseases actually fit that model, that you could assure me that with your patient, or person, relative, friend with hypertension or coronary artery disease or severe arthritis or diabetes, that you have a cure that will take away their condition. Right? Very hard to think of those, right? Well, we have a cure for a chronic condition of homelessness. And so then the only question is, so how do we implement this on a scale, right? That's another thing I don't want to talk about. I don't want to talk about whether or not we can create successful programs to house homeless people, right? Many people in this room have created already successful programs to house people. What I want to know is, what would it take for us to house all of the homeless people, right? To me, that's the question, not can we create a great housing program for homeless people. Mercy does that every day. As do a number of you. So what are the building blocks to housing people, all people who are homeless? Well, so first I do have to divide the problem, or at least I view it as, you know, in the grand scheme in terms of solving, there are two broad swaths of this. One are people who are homeless entirely because of economic factors. They need affordable housing. They don't need additional services. They're just like any of us. They are perfectly capable of living in their home, but they need to be able to afford it. And there are a variety of economic things that can be done, including the building of affordable housing, housing subsidy, low-income rent credits, helping people to be able to take advantage of some of the benefits that are available, zoning policies which require that when cities like Los Angeles are undergoing these rapid housing builds, that there's a requirement that a certain number of units get set aside, right? That's something that happens in New York City. That's something that happens in San Francisco. At the moment, that is not something that happens in the city of Los Angeles. I think it's a critical part if you want to fix that part of the problem. What I want to talk most about, because I'm not expert in the economic part of housing, what I feel I know the most about and what I want to engage you in the panel on is those people who need more than just the affordable unit, those people for whom the affordable unit is part of the answer, but they need supportive services if they're going to find their way to true housing. And also, going back to the relationship with Mercy, that's one thread that pulled me into this conversation is Mercy as a value-conscious organization, when they were building their low-income housing, wanted to be able to include those people who were most vulnerable, those people who were living on the streets, suffering from mental illness or physical illness or addiction, but knew, well, we're a housing provider, we need partners who can do the services. And so one of the models that we've learned of how we do housing for people who need supportive services is team up with a great provider like Mercy. You know, they'll build the housing, make an arrangement with them that you'll provide the health services that will keep people in that housing. And that's been a very successful strategy. But in and of itself, it's not going to solve the problem. It's one part to team up with those providers who are doing the low-income housing, team up with them. I think the two solutions that I want to focus on are the money that is in the healthcare system and the money that is in the incarceration system. And the reason I want to focus on that is that we make progress by coming up with feasible solutions that work in our pluralistic, consensus-building society, right? We might all have a vision of what the world should look like, but part of the problem is that those visions might not be so different in this room, but if you include everybody, you'll get very different visions, right? From those people who might envision a guaranteed high-quality place for everyone to live, to those people who believe deeply in individual responsibility and a tiny government and people pulling themselves up. What I always try to focus on is, okay, you know, I can't, you know, that's the nature of pluralism, right? Different opinions. What I need to focus on is what's feasible. What's practical? What can I make happen? Because the point is not for all of us to have the same opinion. That's never going to happen. Well, so money is in the healthcare system, right? Healthcare, as Doug explained, very expensive system. Well, it seems to me as a practicing doctor, taxpayers should want me to provide the most cost-effective treatment, right? They should want me, when I'm seeing someone, to do whatever would be the most cost-effective, and cost-effective includes cost and effective, right? So that means I'm looking at the person before me. Let's say it's a homeless person with an infection and an addiction and a mental illness. What should I do for them? Well, maybe I could send them for a lot of laboratory tests. Well, that's nice because that's all paid for. It's just down the hall, right? I might want to do some CT scanning of the MRI. Maybe I'm, recognize that there's a small chance that the infection that they have on their leg maybe is going down as far as the bone. Maybe they need more than a short course of antibiotics. I don't think so, but if I want to be sure, I can send them for an MRI. I send them for a bone scan. I could send them for an appointment to deal with their mental illness. So I could arrange for a clinician to see them, talk about with them how hard it is to be homeless. Let's get out our feelings on how challenging it is to live onto the freeway, to not know where your next meal is coming from, and how frightening that is. And we could come to some conclusion about how that leads to that person having more, delusions, help them with the understanding of how their homelessness makes their mental illness worse. I could send them I give them a piece of paper with the addresses of the various 12-step programs and tell them, well, even though you're living on the street, it's really time to, really, go down to those 12-step meetings. None of that sounds very likely to succeed, does it? In practice, it almost never succeeds because people are dealing with such overwhelming challenges getting through the next day that they're focused on things like, what am I going to eat next? How am I going to survive if I am weaker from this infection? These voices are telling me things, that are really frightening. So I could send all of those tests, I could make those appointments, or I could house them. Now, were I to house them, what would happen is their mental illness would get better. It would not go away, but it would get better because they would feel secure, and so the paranoia would be less. I'm not sure it's paranoia when you're afraid to fall asleep onto the freeway that someone's going to hurt you. Their addiction will get better. Will they become abstinent? Probably not, at least not at first. But they will use less. They will shoot less. They will shoot more responsibly. They will be less likely to overdose themselves. They will get fewer of the infections that I'm currently treating them for. And what's the cost of this? It would cost about $1,000. In my system currently, it cost, after the reimbursements that I could get, it costs about $1,000 a month to do that. One scan would cost me more than that. Just one of those purposeless scans. So my view is, whatever one's overall feelings are about the issue, here we have a solution. And nobody disagrees that clinicians should be providing the most cost-effective solution. I'll tell you the other end of the story in Los Angeles. When I first came here, I was touring LACUSC, one of our 4 hospitals, the largest, serves a very low-income community. And I was asking the doctors about the challenges, and they said, well, we have all these homeless people that we can't discharge. I said, oh, well, I've worked on the housing issues and homeless issues. That's really difficult issue. Why don't you house them? I said, well, we can't house them. We don't have money for that. Like, you don't have money to house them, but you have $2,000 a day to keep them in the hospital? How does that work? People just like staring. Well, but we can't just use the money. Well, why not? Well, because we don't have any contracts to do that. Okay, well, let's create the contracts to do that. And that is, in fact, what we've done in Los Angeles. We've now used that path to house over 2,000 people, and I think we're up to 2,345 was the last number I saw, and that's been about 2.5 years. And the number one way that we have done it is to divert money that would have been medical expenses and instead done something to markedly improve people's health. I'm going to leave for Sharon the challenge of, what it would take to get other payers to recognize that they too have those same savings. Because obviously, when we started doing it, I'm just looking at general fund, right? And so under general fund, if you will, it's like my ultimate waiver. The county is paying for the people to stay in the hospital because they're uninsured. County could pay less for them to have dignity and for me to improve their health. Not that hard a choice. It's just a question of implementing it. As we move, more people now have Medicaid, which is a good thing, and Medicaid does pay for supportive services, so we're part of the way, but we need to crack the nut a little bit more to be able to cover the costs of the bricks and mortar. So I want to posit to all of you that the solution, or a large part of the solution, is right there in the healthcare expenses. And Doug mentioned assisted living and, well, not specifically, but long-term care for seniors and others. So I'll point that out to you as well. People say, well, Medicaid does not cover housing, which is a true statement, unless you call it a nursing home and force everybody into a set of routines that they don't want. You take away their independence, you put them in rooms, force somebody else to take care of them, then it's okay to pay for housing under Medicaid. But if you actually want to grant them dignity and independence, no, at the moment not. But that seems, again, like a nut that's crackable, right? You're not asking for more money. You're asking to spend the same money, maybe less, in a way that would have greater impact for that person. That's a winnable fight. We haven't won it yet, but it's entirely winnable. And when we win, it opens up a whole set of other payers. So the other big one that exists in LA and nationally, and I think needs a lot more work, is incarceration. So since it's the area I intend to spend most of my next several years working on, I want to tell you a little bit about the LA system and let you imagine, if you're from somewhere else, you know, what it looks like in New York or Chicago or San Francisco. In Los Angeles County Jail, the average daily census is 26,000 people. 1,600 people arrive and leave every day. 30% of the people have a recognized mental illness so severe that they're on an antipsychotic medicine. If you included post-traumatic stress syndrome, depression, and other mental illnesses, you'd get to about 70%. Now remember that there's a huge difference between jail and prison, right? Prison is typically in this country where we send people who commit violent crimes, murder, rape, and generally we're sending them away for long periods of time. Whatever your belief is about that, one can understand that it has a deterrent effect for the community. That is to say, if you send people away for 10 years, they're not going to commit violent crime in the neighborhood. They may well be committing violent crime in the jail, in the prison, but it's not going to be in your neighborhood. But I want you to remember that jail, with those 26,000 people, the average length of time is 6 months. So there's no deterrent. You're not sending people away. That isn't the people who are there. People who are there, number one crimes are trespassing, stealing a car, petty theft, public urination, probation violation, carrying a knife. These are the things, shoplifting. These are the crimes. A large number of people have never been convicted of anything. They are pre-trial, right? Nobody in this country, right? You're innocent until proven guilty. You get arraigned, usually on about day 3, day 4. Your arraignment includes your bail amount of money. But of course, if you're poor, you can't make bail. So it's not true that the people who are in jail are necessarily the people who've committed the worst crime. In fact, for example, in the case of drugs, the drug kingpin person, he doesn't stay in jail. He gets bailed out within 2 hours. It's the runners who stay in jail, right? So jail is, you know, for those of us who are very focused on, you know, how do we make this a more just society, and have worked on things about ethnic disparities and racial disparities, there is no disparity like what the jail is. You can walk, and I take care of prisoners in jail. When I walk through the jail, it is very hard to find a white guy. Everybody's black or brown, straight down the cells as you walk, right? We're not talking about a 10% higher prevalence. We're talking about everybody is black and brown, right? They're there primarily because they're poor, right? So in this setting, then I want to ask you, not as housing people or as social activists, I want you to imagine yourselves, you're really hard-nosed taxpayers, right? That's what you're really focused on. You know, I want my tax dollars well spent. So how much are you spending for this? $150,000 a year to keep people, many of whom have never been convicted of a crime but are in jail because they're poor, who have severe mental illness. Some of them so severe they can't even go before the judge because they're not competent to have a trial. So they languish in jail, awaiting the time that they might be clear enough to go through. The recurrence rate, the recidivism rate for being in jail for the mentally ill is 75% of the seriously mentally ill who are arrested and jailed and then released. 75% of them are back in jail in 6 months. And again, as that hard-nosed taxpayer, you can understand why. They have a severe mental illness. They get arrested for one of those crimes. They spend 6 months in jail where they're essentially lying in a cell for 24 hours a day. Then they're released after 4 months, 3 months, 6 months. They're given a bus token, maybe an appointment about where to go. Most of them are homeless. What do you think happens? They go back to whatever the life was that they had before they went into jail. And the cycle repeats itself. The reason I focus on this again is not the horrible disparity that I see, not the fact that I think that this is inhumane, but look at the money. What couldn't we do for $150,000 a year? What services for the mentally ill couldn't we do? And if, in fact, depending on the crime, depending upon the court, these people have a debt to pay to society, then we let them pay the debt after they have been, cleared of their mental illness, right? After they have been stabilized, after they're in getting the appropriate treatment. And that appropriate treatment cannot happen in the jail. It's just not the right setting. People can do the very best they can, but the jail is never going to be, nor should it be, the place where we're providing treatment. So, my challenge to all of us for the LA system, for the other jail systems across the country, and I don't know if any of you are from New York has a very exciting program that's looking at waiving bail, the actual dollar amount. Because guess what? It turns out that the people we're speaking, even if they don't put down money, they don't fly off to the Canary Islands. Turns out that that is not what they do, right? They go back to the very same neighborhood they came in because they have no other recourse, right? So we don't have to spend the money to keep them in jail. We could put them in programs. And we're currently working on the very first diversion program. We've diverted 70 people in the group of mentally incompetent to stand trial. We have them all now in treatment. We're tracking the data so that we can show that people in treatment, as we know to be true, they will get competent sooner. They'll have their day in court. They'll be able to, plead innocent to guilty. They have to serve time. They'll serve their time. But they will not just be trapped in court. So these people contribute to the wave of the circle of incarceration, homeless, psychiatric emergency, homeless, jail, and on and on. They contribute to the problems of foster care, right? Because people don't have their fathers, their mothers, causes family disintegration and other costs. So I would say besides the health system, our second, largest collection of dollars is in the justice system, and that we can do a lot better. We can make society safer, that by treating these people, this is not about, taking risks with our communities and our safety. This is about what are the sensible steps to take to make our communities safer. So Doug, I think that gives us two big pots of money to think about. I'm very interested what the other panelists have to say about how we get into that and what members of the audience think about the progress to be made.
Okay, great. Thanks. So, Steve, you have the unfortunate task of coming after Dr. Katz. But so Dr. Steve Wallace is a professor and chair of the Department of Community Health Sciences here at UCLA, an expert in the area of aging, particularly issues I think that are going to tie tightly to the conversation that Mitch had and some of the comments that were made earlier around long-term care. So with that, Dr. Steve Wallace.
Great, thank you. So we're supposed to be a little bit provocative and to provide ideas so that we can have an interesting discussion later. So I just wanted, being a professor of public health, to start with a public health perspective. A lot of times we talk about public health and we think of the letters that are outside restaurants, the A's and B's, and hopefully no C's. But public health is much broader than that. Public health, the definition of public health is assuring the conditions under which people can be healthy. And I think it's no argument to any of you in this room that housing is one of those essential conditions that people can be healthy by. And so at the federal level, internationally, and even at the local level, we're increasingly looking at what we're calling health in all policies. In sociology, we call it social determinants of health. That's a little jargony. And so what policymakers are talking about is to really look at the health impacts of transportation and education and housing policies and how those all affect health. But that's one direction, and I think the purpose of this meeting is to look at the other direction also and see how health can link back into housing. So one of the projects that I've been involved with for almost 10 years now is called the Elder Economic Security Standard Index. That's trying to reimagine ways of looking at a decent minimum standard of living for older adults and really taking issue with the federal poverty line. So Mitch mentioned the number of people, or maybe it was Doug, sorry, the number of people in poverty in California, and then with the new way of looking at poverty, how that jumps. If you look at older adults are the group that has the highest medical care expenses and also have the lowest income. Most of them are retired on fixed incomes. And if you look at what it takes for a minimum standard of living, you look at the cost of food, the cost of health care, the cost of transportation, and the cost of housing. And that is really what drives economic security among older adults in the country. Just as a couple examples, so this year, 2016, the federal poverty line that the federal government uses, when you hear Medicaid covers up to 133% of FPL, this is that FPL, is about $12,000 for a single person. So that says the federal government says anybody anywhere in the country, it's $1 amount, should be able to survive on $12,000 a year. Now, another agency in the federal government, Housing and Urban Development, goes and does a survey of what they call fair market rents. What does it cost to rent a sort of minimally decent apartment in different urban areas? So the fair market rent this year in Los Angeles for a one-bedroom apartment, which is what we use when we're calculating the elder index, the money needed. Anybody want to take a guess? Is it more or less than the entire federal poverty line? Okay, I guess that's a good answer. So the federal poverty line is about $12,000. Fair market rent for a one-bedroom apartment in LA is about $14,000 a year. That's $1,100 a month. When I tell this to my students, they go, "Really? Can you show me where that apartment is?" In contrast, when you go to Des Moines, Iowa, which is a city, I mean, this is not like out in a rural area, the fair market rent for that same one-bedroom apartment is $520 a month, or about $6,200 a year. So it's half of what it costs in LA. And I should ask Mitch if he has an idea of what the fair market rent is in San Francisco. He can't, yeah, you know, we got him and now he's stuck here. So it's about $22,000 a year for one-bedroom apartment in San Francisco compared to about $12,000 for the federal poverty line. So if you are if you're $1 over the federal poverty line in San Francisco, you have enough money to spend for 6 months and no other costs, no food, no transportation, no medicine, nothing in San Francisco. So when we calculate the elder index in San Francisco, it's about 3 times the federal poverty line. That's how much money you need for a basic standard of living. If you don't have that, you end up splitting pills, you end up eating less food, you end up having substandard housing, which leads to all sorts of problems for people who have chronic health conditions to start with. So housing really does become a major determinant of health for older adults. When we look statewide, about 40% of low-income elders of color rent in California. So the image of most older adults is, oh, but they're fine, they've got their homes, it's paid off. That's not the group we need to worry about. But when we look at older adults who are limited income and Latino or African American, 40% of them are renting. About a quarter of low-income non-Hispanic whites are renting. So they're very subject to the vagaries of rental markets and prices going up and down. And our data shows that over 1 million older adults who are heads of households in California have incomes under the elder index. So this is the group that's going to be the most at risk for homelessness. If they're not able to pay the rent, if their rents go up, most cities don't have rent control, so they're at risk for a long list of challenges due to their rental costs. So affordability of housing is a key condition under which older adults and all people can be healthy. And the World Health Organization has a program called Age-Friendly Cities. And Age-Friendly Cities has 5 goals, the first one of which is, not surprisingly, affordable housing. Another one, which relates to what was referenced earlier, were services to help people age in place. So most older adults want to continue living where they were living as they grew older. You know, a house is also a home, and a home has a lot of psychological and other meanings as well. And so services in the person's home that can help them remain at home is also critical. So that's where we start seeing a lot of services, home services, interacting with housing as well. They also talk about universal design. So when you're thinking about low-income housing, it's important to realize that people who may be moving in there, maybe if they're not elderly yet, ideally will reach old age and may need ramps, may need grab bars, may need accessible showers. And if you build it in from the beginning, then that housing serves people with disabilities as well as with people with a wide range of abilities. So that's the way that housing influences health, but I think the topic of this meeting is how health influences housing. And I think an interesting experiment is Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, has a new replication project out that will be starting this fall called Accountable Health Communities. And what they're trying to do is to break down the silos between medical care and social services. This new round of pilot projects intends to screen everybody who comes into a primary care clinic, an emergency room, a labor and delivery suite, and find out if they have social needs. So we've built a medical care structure in the United States that focuses on diseases, but diseases are subject to more than pills and surgeries. They're also subject to the conditions under which people live. So these accountable health communities are supposed to provide referrals, navigation, warm handoffs to people who evidence housing instability and poor quality housing, who have needs to pay for utilities. So having a house doesn't help a lot if you can't heat it, especially if you're not in Los Angeles, if you can't pay for the electricity, in addition to food insecurity, interpersonal violence, and transportation. So what they're trying to do is to see if they can prove on a national level that they actually save money. So going back to Mitch's point, you know, Jesse James was asked why he robbed banks, and he said that's where the money is. So if you're looking for money for housing, where do you go? Well, the healthcare system consumes about 1/6 of our gross domestic product. So we can either grow and put more money into housing, or we can redistribute some of the money we're already spending. And CMS, hopefully, I mean, this is a replication, so there's some initial data that shows that if you provide these services, if you can connect people with community resources, you can reduce the number of emergency department visits, very expensive. You can reduce inpatient hospital admissions, even more expensive. You can increase the quality of care that people receive and reduce total costs of health care. Now the trick here is if Medicaid saves money, how do you get that into services that the people are receiving that saves Medicaid money? So that's one of my challenges to mention is the financial silos that we have. It's very hard in the United States given the way our budgets are allocated, maybe unless you get county general funds, to say we're saving Medicaid $1 billion and we're doing that by providing supportive housing. And so we'll share that savings with you. You know, just give us $500 million and we'll let you keep the other half. So that's a challenge, is to figure out how to break down the silos in funding. Even if you have broken down the silos, that's pretty amazing. We're doing some projects in South LA with community health centers and other providers. And medical care providers really don't know much about community resources. You know, they're all very interested conceptually, but when you ask them about what would you do if you had an older adult who was socially isolated, and they'd say, oh, I don't know, I'd tell them to get involved in some activities. And where would you send them? They go, well, I don't know. Well, what about the senior center 2 blocks down the street? Oh, there's a senior center 2 blocks away, right? They drive by every day coming to work, but their focus is dealing with the asthma and the coronary heart disease and the other types of issues. So trying to provide information across sectors so that each sector knows a little bit about the other one. And so my area is healthcare. I would hazard a guess that the housing sector doesn't really know a whole lot about what's available in the healthcare sector either. And then making the linkages between the two. It's not enough to do, as Mitch said, you know, just hand them a piece of paper and say, Here's a list of referrals you can do. That's traditionally what they did in hospitals when you were being discharged. They'd give you a list and say, you know, good luck. Here's the things that might be able to help you. And increasingly now the federal government is providing incentives. Hospitals are providing more resources. So the handoffs are warm handoffs. It's not simply here's a list, but it's a let me introduce you, let me walk you through the process. You're eligible, but you have to go through the eligibility process and actually connect people with services. So challenges, once again, are how to align incentives, and then also how to document the impacts of bringing services and housing together. So we can all agree, I think, on a principled basis that this is a good thing to do. When you're talking to legislators, whether they're boards of supervisors or Congress people, what they want to see is the evidence that even if it doesn't save money, at least is cost neutral or only costs a little bit more. And so you really have to document the impacts on both systems and show over a relatively short amount of time that you're going to save money. Legislators have 2-year terms, sometimes 4 or 6-year terms. So if you're saying there's a 20-year payoff, it's a much harder argument to make that they should vote than if there's a year or 2 payoff. So solutions, one modest and one audacious. The modest one is in healthcare for the elderly. We have a thing called Program for All-Inclusive Care of the Elderly, which was started in San Francisco. And that basically bundles payments between Medicare and Medicaid for people who are at risk of nursing home institutionalization. And lets the organization decide what services the person needs. It basically gets rid of all of the restrictions about what you need money for. So if you need money to fix a roof because a person can't afford to fix the roof, and if they don't fix the roof, they'll end up in a nursing home, then that organization can do that. They do a lot of home-delivered meals. They do a lot of adult day health care. So if you can identify people across the life course who are at risk of high medical care costs and homelessness and can somehow come together and design a program like PACE where it bundles the money that would have been spent in health care and housing and criminal justice, I think is a brilliant one to bundle in that as well. Then you can really loosen the boundaries of the silos that we're in and provide the services that are needed. The bigger one that I was thinking about this morning coming in was we need to get one of the presidential candidates to put as their landmark policy something around housing and healthcare. So when Obama was elected, he sort of had 2 main planks that people held him accountable for. One was healthcare reform and the other was immigration reform. He got halfway there, which is better than most. But if you think about the current candidates, none of the candidates really has a strong vision for a particular sector. So I think if we could convince, it's a little late in the game now, but if we could convince one of the leading candidates, maybe that to win California, they need to come out strongly on a housing and healthcare plank, I think that that would then elevate the issue and might help move forward some of the solutions. So in conclusion, health and all policies approach is a natural for looking at housing. You need to look at how housing affects health as well as health affects housing. And there is so much money in medical care, as Mitch said, that if we can use a little bit of that for housing to keep people healthier, we'll create a virtuous cycle where there'll be more money available to provide supportive housing. That supportive housing will decrease medical care costs enough that you can provide more affordable housing. I think that's it. Thanks.
All right, well, that's a perfect lead-in for Sharon. I'm sure many people in the room know Sharon Rapport, who's the Associate Director of California Policy for the Corporation for Supportive Housing. And I've known Sharon for a very long time, and I'm just now learning her title, and now all of it makes sense to me. But as Dr. Wiles was referencing, we're trying to connect the dots here, and I'm looking over at Sharon and Jonathan Istran, who the 3 of us spent, I think 6 to 9 months sort of locked in a room together with the Department of Healthcare Services trying to work on the waiver, the Medicaid 1115 waiver. There was a variety of groups, and we were in the housing and healthcare group together, and Sharon really staffed a lot of that work. And so part of what she's going to share today is just sort of what did that all result in? Where have we been able to make progress? And I think a little bit about where we haven't been able to make progress, and then that'll lead into the panel discussion, and then Q&A from everyone else. So with that, Sharon Rapport.
Yes.
the pop.
Good afternoon, everybody. I find I need a PowerPoint whenever I talk about Medicaid, so excuse the old-fashioned technique of speaking.
We're all going to look at your movie.
Okay, good, good. I did want to start off by just saying a lot of what I'm going to be saying may sound a little repetitive. I think we're all kind of touching along the same lines of the difficulties of bridging these silos. As Doug mentioned, I'm with the Corporation for Supportive Housing, so I'll just put in a plug for my organization. We are a national nonprofit and a community development financial institution. We work to advance solutions to a lot of issues that vulnerable populations face, and we promote the creation of more housing opportunities to address those needs. Trying to address the needs particularly of chronically homeless people. That's been our history. We've really focused on homelessness throughout our history, but we also work in other states around trying to address the needs of people in nursing homes, people with developmental disabilities, and all of those populations are connected. All of them are using high rates of public costs and not achieving very good outcomes. So our goal is really to build stronger, healthier communities. So we know, as I think Dr. Katz and others have mentioned, we know from data over the last 20+ years that people who are homeless or unstably housed have very poor health outcomes, and they cost Medicaid a lot of money. We know that homeless people, for example, are getting older. The average age of a homeless person now is 50. And while 50, I like to think now 50 isn't that old, but for a homeless person, it is old, because a homeless person who's aging is going to suffer the same conditions that somebody who's much older suffers. So there was a report that just came out a couple weeks ago in the Gerontologist journal, healthcare journal around people who are aging, that talked about somebody who's 52 having the body of a 76-year-old. Or a 78-year-old. So we know that homelessness takes tremendous toll on the body. And for that reason, we have somebody on our staff who works on elder homelessness and English. She's here. And we just find increasingly issues surrounding aging and homelessness and housing instability in general. Despite all of these research findings, we also know that even though Medicaid system saves a great deal of money by moving people from homelessness to housing, it's not spending the money to achieve those results. The housing system is spending the bulk of the resources to get people moved from homelessness to housing. Even for those people, we know there's this huge connection between housing and healthcare. So how do we get there? I think that's the big topic for today. We, I think, have been thinking over the last 10 or 15 years on really trying to scale up, as others have mentioned. And the way to scale up is to look at systems that have greater wealth than the housing system. And Medicaid is the perfect example, the perfect place to look, because in terms of just dollars, dollars that fund Medicaid are so much greater than the dollars that fund any housing programs that we work on. But the challenge has been, how do we get to that point? And it almost does seem like a miracle to get the Medicaid system to even think about paying for housing. We're getting a little bit closer, though, and at least having the conversations. I think with the Affordable Care Act and other interventions and other innovations in how to think about healthcare, the healthcare system does seem to be thinking about the paying for social services interventions, or at least linking healthcare and social services as a healthcare intervention. California is not known for being the great innovator in our Medicaid program. We are 48th in terms of what we pay on a per person basis for Medicaid. New York is number 1 or 2. So we are far behind a lot of other states when it comes to innovation in Medicaid. But our state has recognized that housing is a healthcare intervention. So even in a state like California that's highly complex, highly diverse, our state Department of Healthcare Services staff did come to recognize healthcare is reliant on somebody being stably housed. And it proposed in the last 1115 Medicaid waiver using some money to Medicaid money to pay for housing. 1115 waivers, just so everybody is up to speed on what that is basically a way for a state to change their Medicaid program to be more innovative, to achieve better outcomes at lower costs. So in California, what our Department of Healthcare Services staff realized is they did some data analysis. They realized that we have about 11,000 nursing home residents who cannot be discharged, not because they need nursing home care, but because they'd be homeless if discharged. So they are living in nursing homes unnecessarily because they have nowhere to go. They've lost their home in the course of being admitted to the nursing home, or they were homeless to begin with, and they now have no place to go if they were discharged. The other population that our state looked at, of course, is chronically homeless people, which are known to be highly expensive to our Medi-Cal system. So we had a work group, Doug mentioned, that the state convened that looked at how can we go about paying for housing and services to get people housed. And there were three main buckets of proposals that the state came up with. The first was to pay for services that help get people housed and keep them stably housed. The second was a creative way to convince the federal Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, that using federal funding to pay for housing makes sense. Federal funding for Medicaid to pay for housing. And this creative way involved basically pooling existing housing resources, allowing managed care health plans to contribute toward the costs of housing, and then tracking savings once people were moved from homelessness to or nursing home care to stable housing, tracking what the savings are to Medi-Cal, and reinvesting those savings into rental subsidies. So that was the proposal that the state came up with, and I'll talk a little bit more about all of these. And the third was really to say if managed care health plans are contributing to the cost of housing, they should be held harmless. They should not be penalized when those costs go down, when medical costs go down. The health plans should be recognized for whatever they contributed to making those costs go down. So in rate setting, they would not be penalized for that. This work group looked at the three buckets of costs that are involved in creating more supportive housing opportunities. So we know we need capital to build more housing, operating to allow that housing to remain operational, and services funding to help keep people stable and stably housed. We did some financial modeling and really felt like the greatest bang for our buck was really to focus on operating and services costs. So that's what our work group did, and that's how we came up with the three proposals. A big piece of the three, as I mentioned, is really giving health plans a greater role in thinking about interventions creatively. So really allowing health plans to use their capitated rate that they get every month to take care of their members' healthcare needs, to pay for things like services and housing, and the cost of housing itself, as well as costs of interim housing or recuperative care. Another piece was, I mentioned the housing pool, and it's a really confusing concept that ended up remaining in the final waiver, but it's even more confusing now than when we proposed it. But really the concept of the housing pool was really to, again, allow contributions to this pool of funds that would be used for short-term and long-term housing costs, and then to track data around cost savings, and then to reinvest those savings into interim housing, recuperative care, and permanent housing costs. So the waiver proposed that the federal government would invest in California's Medi-Cal system in the order of about $17 billion. In being highly innovative and creative, the state wasn't willing to put in any state money toward those investments. They just wanted federal money. They proposed that these innovations would save a lot of federal dollars, and that moving people or keeping people in managed care, which really happened with the last waiver 5 years ago, will continue to save the federal government enough money that the feds should be responsible for paying for the costs of the waiver. Surprisingly to no one, CMS did not agree. They thought the state should have some skin in the game, and so our waiver ended up going from a $17 billion waiver to $6.39 billion. That's the amount that the final waiver ends up investing. And so what happened is that a lot of the proposals that were in the waiver got discarded or consolidated with other proposals, other programs. And one example of that is the housing proposal. The housing proposal got consolidated with the whole person care pilot proposal. And that whole person care pilot proposal ends up doing some of what the housing proposal intended to do, but not all. And of course, the biggest piece was that CMS came back and said you cannot use any federal Medicaid money to pay for the costs of housing, the long-term costs of housing. So we have our final waiver now, and I'll talk about what exactly that does and what opportunities that affords California counties. Before the waiver was approved, I just wanted to mention this informational bulletin that came out. So CMS came out with an informational bulletin about 3 months after the state proposed paying for housing through Medicaid. And what the informational bulletin basically said is that for those people for whom housing is a healthcare intervention, Medicaid can be used to pay for housing-related activities. Those activities include what they called transition services. Those are basically services that help somebody find a landlord willing to take a lower rental subsidy or a lower payment for rent, helping people with housing applications, helping homeless people or people who are being discharged from nursing homes with documentation, anything that that person needs to get into a place to live, finding furniture that they can get for free to furnish their apartment. Those are considered transition services. The other bucket that they talked about is services that promote housing stability. So once somebody is housed, services that help them stay stably housed. And then the third bucket that they talked about were services that were short-term housing interventions, and those include security deposits, recuperative care, interim housing. Those are potentially costs that could be covered by Medicaid. But the informational bulletin also came out with a very strong statement saying Medicaid, at least federal dollars used for Medicaid, cannot be used to pay for long-term costs of housing. And CMS cited this regulation that says Medicaid can't pay for room and board. As Dr. Katz mentioned, it's okay to pay for room and board as long as you're institutionalizing somebody, but it's not okay to pay for room and board if they're living independently. So that's basically what the informational bulletin said. And what is in the whole person care pilots is based heavily on that informational bulletin. The whole person care pilot program offers federal funding of $300 million a year for the 5 years of the waiver, so a total of $1.5 billion. Counties can access this pot of funds if they can come up with a way to pay for the costs of the various interventions I'll talk about that are allowed to be paid for under the whole person care pilots. If they pay for those up front, then they'll get 50% reimbursement from the feds through this $300 million pot. The whole person care pilot is intended to address the needs of people who are high users of multiple systems. It includes homeless people, it includes nursing home residents. By and large, though, counties are probably not going to be motivated to address the nursing home population just because they're not the ones financially at risk for that population. So what can the whole person care pilots pay for? A county who's applying for the whole person care pilot funds can use the funds for a great variety of interventions, infrastructure, administrative, data, services itself. So there are a lot of different things that the counties can use the money for. They can use the money to create partnerships. So partnerships that work to remove barriers and silos between the systems. And they cite as one example trying to create the administrative infrastructure to prepare for a health home benefit, and I'm going to touch on that benefit in just a few minutes. They can use the money to help collect data and identify populations that are high users of multiple systems and are costly to Medi-Cal. They can use the money to provide services that I mentioned from the informational bulletin. All those services can be funded through the Whole Person Care Pilot, which is definitely a step forward for California. Right now, we really don't have any funding that helps us pay for services to get connected to housing or to stay stably housed for homeless populations, except unless you have a serious mental illness. So under Medi-Cal mental health, there is some funding for that. Otherwise, there's no funding through Medi-Cal to pay for those services. And the last category is for this housing pool. So as I mentioned, the housing pool still exists in the whole person care pilot concept. But the idea that health plans can contribute money to that pool and consider those contributions in the costs of care, that is not included in the whole person care pilot. So the housing pool is a little less meaningful than it was when we came up with the idea in our work group that Doug was on. I think there are a lot of different ways that counties can access the whole person care pilot money. And I'm hoping counties can use this money to think outside the box. Of course, we want to be able to use the money to pay for services that we can't now fund, but this money can also be used to break down those silos, to think through how we can create programs like what Dr. Katz has created in LA County, or to expand those programs. And so the money can be used, and these are examples that the state itself has cited. It can be used to really try and match data that we have from our homeless systems with data that the health plans have. Health plans don't know who's homeless right now, so if we can get our homeless data to be matched with their health plan data, health plans can discover who are their homeless members. Can use the money to figure out, once we know who the homeless members are of health plans, how do we get them housed? How do we create a process where we really are maximizing all of our existing resources? We can use the money, I think somebody earlier mentioned the difficulties of just getting people in the same room to talk together. This money can be used to do that. It's expensive to do that, believe it or not, but money can be used to get people talking across healthcare sectors. Data sharing is a huge issue. It's very difficult to share data between behavioral health providers alone, let alone behavioral health, primary care, and social services systems. This money can be used to do that. It can be used to strengthen coordinated assessment and entry systems. And of course, it can be used to pay for the services themselves. So I'm going to just touch on something I mentioned, a health home benefit, because we really do see this benefit as another potential opportunity to kind of break down silos and bring in social services as a healthcare intervention. The health home benefit is an optional benefit states can take advantage of. It's included within the Affordable Care Act, and it allows states to access 90% federal funding for the first 2 years to pay for services that coordinate and integrate care for Medi-Cal populations who have complex conditions. A few years ago, CSH co-sponsored legislation to authorize the state to take advantage of this benefit, and to require the state to use the benefit to address the needs of frequent hospital users and chronically homeless people. And so the state is on the road to implementing this benefit. After about 5 years of working with the state, we think that the benefit will actually begin in January of 2017. It'll take a couple of years for it to be fully implemented, but we are hopeful that it can eventually provide a whole range of services that will pay for everything from outreaching to people on the street, to getting them into housing, to making sure that they're stably housed. The benefit is not going to be used to pay for housing either. It can't be used to pay for housing, but it can be used to pay for a whole host of services that the state can define. Luckily, the feds haven't come up with any regulations defining what all of these services are, and so there's great latitude for the state to define these services in a way that breaks down the silos between our medical system, our behavioral health system, and our social services systems. So we still are a long way for paying for housing with Medi-Cal. We actually, at CSH, I do a lot of legislative work. I'm a lobbyist in Sacramento. And so we are working on legislation now and a budget ask that would use state Medicaid dollars or Medi-Cal dollars to pay for rental subsidies. And really, this is the same as asking for state general fund dollars, because that's basically what it is. But by calling it Medi-Cal dollars and having it go through our Medi-Cal system, we are hoping that those rental subsidies can do what some of the other speakers talked about doing, really trying to create an initial investment in rental subsidies that can be paired with services that will be available under these opportunities. And then really tracking data to demonstrate that moving people from homelessness to housing saves Medi-Cal money, and it saves enough money that the program can be self-sustaining and grow over time. So that's the idea behind our legislation. I think in your packets there's included a fact sheet about it. And again, we also have a budget ask. I think the challenges in all of this work continues to be that we see things as housers, we see things through the housing lens, and as healthcare policymakers, we see things through the healthcare lens, particularly medical lens. As housing advocates, it's hard to remember, but the Medi-Cal system serves 12 million beneficiaries right now. And our housing system doesn't even come close to serving 1 million people in California. So just really trying to think of the scale, the difference in scale is very difficult. We know that that means that we can take advantage of the differences in scale to really try and scale up our housing opportunities, but it really takes us looking at how does the healthcare system benefit and how do we work within that very highly medicalized system. So I thank you and look forward to the discussion.
All right, if we could get the panelists back up.